We can all agree there are some objectively bad video games out there. Stuff like Redfall, The Last of Us 2, Horizon Zero Dawn, and I'm sure there are plenty of others we can all just sit here and talk about. Games like Halo, Resident Evil, Mario, Zelda, and one of the worst games, I think objectively speaking, would be Hollow Knight. I mean, we can all know, or we all agree, that it's just such a horrible game. One of, if not, one of the worst indie games of the past 10 years. And right now, there's probably several video game essayists preparing to write 10 to 20 minute attack videos, probably some random game footage in the background. But here's the thing, I'm not the one who said that about Hollow Knight. The community said that, with more than 40% of the player base quitting the game before they even get through the first hour. That is actually worse than the rate of people who quit Elden Ring. So, for today's critical thought, we're once again talking about churn, what it means to a video game, how it can sink a studio, and why is it so damn hard to figure out why something went wrong. As we've said plenty of times when it comes to understanding and discussing game design and game dev, a major aspect of growing your knowledge base and your understanding of design is being able to iterate and evolve what you do. And a major point about this is understanding what churn means to your game. The churn rate of a game is essentially how quickly or the drop-off rates that occur as someone plays through your title. This can happen very fast, it can happen very slow, but no matter what the game is, whether it is some simple match 3 game to a Fortnite, No Man's Sky, whatever, every game will have some element of churn. As a designer, your goal is to keep the churn rate as small as you can. And that means making sure that you understand UI, UX, approachability, good tutorials, onboarding, the whole 9 yards. And those are topics that in of themselves are way too big to get into for today. But what we want to talk about today is the importance of understanding the churn rate of your game. In the first part of this, while every one of you is probably still fuming at some of those comments, every game, no matter how good it is, no matter how much you love it, no matter how much you're willing to make 30-minute long attack videos about it, has churn to it. And as I've said before, understanding what can drive someone away from a game is just as important as understanding what attracts them to it. And this is something that for a lot of indie developers, they struggle with this idea of churn. That, hey, if I really like my game, then why doesn't everyone else do? And one of the problems that comes with churn is that it never really affects your first game. And we'll come back to that point in a few minutes. But what causes churn? This could easily be like an hour-long discussion right here. But let's kind of start at the high level and work our way down. Very first thing that can cause churn is the presentation, or specifically the onboarding of your game. There are people who have done this. Started the game, looked at the new game menu, start a game, main screen loads up, take one look at it and go, nope, uninstall and never play your game again. And it's why I always harp on the first 30 minutes to an hour of a game, because this is where you're going to have a lot of people who will quit. And some of you will say, an hour? That sounds like an awful short amount of time to have people decide the fate of your game, and you're right. Some of them decide within 5 minutes of loading your game up. And I just basically gave everyone watching this a stress attack with that sentence. When we look at what stops someone from playing, you're going to find all number of reasons, but the first and the most popular ones are pain points. If your game is annoying someone within 2 minutes of loading it up, that is a huge red flag, and this can mean just about anything. Maybe they don't like how you set up the sorting in your UI. Maybe the character doesn't jump right. Or they hit the attack button, there's this weird delay. You didn't properly get the animation to match right. These are all very potential and, unfortunately for you, very credible reasons for someone to stop playing a game. As we dig deeper again, every game is going to have churn. There is no game out there that has a 100% clear rate. No matter how popular it is, no matter how great you may think it is, or how many awards it has gotten. And as a game goes on, what will stop someone from playing can usually be tied to difficulty spikes, pain points, and this is something that, again, as a developer, you're kind of in control, but not really. Point or a part of the progression of a game is growing the design. It's about escalating and iterating. All the best games will grow their challenge or grow what they expect the player to do. This is what we talk about when we discuss the skill floor and the skill ceiling of a game. But if a game doesn't feel right, if it doesn't properly onboard or train the player, then what ends up happening is that a lot of people, the second they hit that first difficulty spike or that first wall, they're out. They don't know what they're going to do. They don't know how to get past this, and they're going to quit. And it's oftentimes why difficulty, in all of its many ways, shapes, and forms, is one of the biggest aspects of churn. But even with that said, some of you may think, well, let's just make a wholesome game. Let's just make a very casual, very easy to play game. Then everyone will play and love it, right? Nope. You see, the other aspect of churn has to do with the experience itself. If playing your game is annoying, if playing it is confusing, if it doesn't really probably explain what the player is supposed to do, they feel lost or frustrated, they're going to quit, even if your game is the easiest game imaginable. Just because your game doesn't have the same difficulty as Elden Ring or is as easy to get into as, say, Candy Crush, doesn't mean that someone's just going to stick around. Now, I've played a lot of games that kind of fall on the wholesome side that are just frustrating, that it just feels like the entire experience is not working right. So that, yes, if someone learns the game, if someone gets past those humps and those spikes, and however you want to call it, they'll enjoy it. And this is where we get into this concept of the difference between a general consumer and a fan of your game. And it's also a good lead into this next point. Why understanding churn matters. Because churn in of itself, it doesn't doom the game that it's found in. It dooms the second, the third, the fourth game from that studio. As we said, one of the major things that kind of differentiates these videos that we do here on Game Wisdom from other channels is that we focus on the game dev, game creation side. If you're a student watching this, if you're someone who's doing this in your part-time and you have no intention of turning game dev into a career for you, then this stuff doesn't necessarily matter to you. But if you are trying to take that step and trying to build a studio, whether you are a 20-person team, 5-person, 1-person, this is where the rubber meets the road. So let's say a little hypothetical. Let's say that a game you work on sells 1 million copies. And I'm sure a few of you out there would, that doesn't sound all that important, right? 1 million copies of my game sold. So, let's say we have 1 million. Within 30 minutes of playing it, 50% of the player base checked out. They're gone, they left, they're never coming back. So, out of that 1 million, you're now sitting at 500,000 potential fans. But let's say no one refunds the game. No one wanted to, upset the developer. They felt it was okay enough, but they just quit. So you're thinking to yourself, well, I'm still 500,000. Or maybe you're still not even thinking about that. You just see the 1 million sales on your store page. Here's where it gets very bad. So you go to your next game, and you think to yourself, well, this is a time for me to go big. 1 million people play my first game. That means my consumer base is 1 million strong. No, it's not. And some of you may think it's 500,000 strong. But guess what? It's not that either. I just said that 500,000 people stopped playing within 30 minutes. I didn't talk about what the other 500,000 people did. Maybe within the next 40 minutes, another 200,000 dropped. Let's say out of the 1 million people who bought your game, only 20,000 of them actually finished it. And right now, I think I just really gave someone a heart attack with that sentence. But you go to your next game, and you're once again thinking, well, 1 million people bought my game, so I'm going to go big. I want to turn 1 million copies sold to 3 million copies sold. And I'm causing heart attacks, I think, every minute of this video. But guess what's going to happen? You're not going to sell 1 million copies on your second game. You're probably not even going to sell 300,000 copies on your second game. You're going to sell far less than that. And this is, again, why churn is such a huge aspect and why you need to understand the reasons that someone will quit playing your game. Because as I've said, there are people, and I've seen this from indie developers, who have some degree of success, who, let's say their first game sold 500,000 copies, and they're bragging about it, or when someone brings up complaints or issues, they go, well, who cares? It sold 500,000 copies, right? And then I look at the churn rate of their game, and it goes from 95 within 5 minutes to 12 in 15 minutes of playing the game. And you see, this is again why this can come back to bite you. Because if you do not understand why someone's going to quit playing your game, you're not going to understand how to retain and grow that audience. Because the goal of every studio is that you want to have at minimum an even or equal number of people who bought your first game buying your second. At most, you want that number to grow. You want to go from 50,000 copies to 75 to 120 to 300,000. You don't want to go 70 to 50 to 20 to 500. And when you don't understand these points, it will come back to bite you plenty of times over. So returning to Hollow Knight, as I've said, Hollow Knight has some tremendous churn to it. And a lot of that comes with the general structure of how the game was presented. The fact that it was a little confusing to find your way around. And again, some of you are going to, of course, interject and say, well, once you learn the game, it's incredibly easy to play. Why are people complaining? Well, you see, this is why onboarding matters. This is why the first 30 minutes to an hour of your game needs to be presented well. It is also very much the reason why having a strong intro is oftentimes better than having a stronger ending. Because if someone quits your game after 30, 40, 60, 80 hours long, yes, they may not be completely happy, they'll still feel that they got their money's worth. If they quit your game within an hour, they're never going to come back to your title, they're never going to check out anything else you've done ever again, because they're going to remember how horrible that experience was. And this is why certain genres have it easier or harder in terms of churn rates. On the easy side, we have anything that is reflex-driven. Action games, shooters, platformers, anything that it can be very easy to pick up that controller and you are off to the races. It's also why these games will oftentimes have this kind of make or break moment within the first 20 minutes. If someone picks up the control of your platformer or your third-person action game, and they are loving it, they are going to stick around. If your game feels awkward to play, if the controls don't work, if your character just is very tanky or cumbersome to control, they're checking out. So the next category are very skill-intensive games. So this is when we talk about stuff like Souls-likes, action roguelikes, fighting games, anything that has a very stiff skill floor. And it's oftentimes why these games tend to lose people. Because they're not ones that you can just pick up and play. A lot of times you're going to pick them up and you get smacked down almost immediately. And there's a greater discussion to be had about processing failure when it comes to some of these games. But For these titles, commonly a bad or poor onboarding is oftentimes the root of the cause for a lot of these churn. It's also why the fighting game genre had this kind of crash in the 2000s. When the arcade market disappeared and you kind of lost that community aspect, the home ports and home versions for a lot of these games were just horrible when it came to training new people. How many fighting games in the past 30 years could we say actually had really great tutorials and onboarding? And it kind of led to this reckoning for the genre that happened over the past decade, with more and more developers focusing on a single player experience, focusing on onboarding, and trying to court people outside of the FGC. And right now, as I'm recording this, Street Fighter 6 is kind of on its way out. And it's going to be very interesting to see if it has that same kind of momentum of success that Mortal Kombat's 9 through 11 had, in terms of trying to reinvent the series to make it more palatable to the non-fighting game, expert crowd. But then the next category of where a lot of games have churn are abstracted games. Your strategy games, your RPGs, JRPG, SRPG, CRPG, any others that you can think of. And the reason why is that these games are notorious for giving the player a lot of stuff to get into. But if they're having trouble within the first 20 seconds of loading up the game, are they really going to stick around and try to learn this game for the next 50 to 100 hours? Because as we all know, a game like Stellaris is such an easy pick up and play kind of game. I mean, you load it up and you've mastered the game in 20 seconds of starting? And the strategy genre in of itself still hasn't had that same kind of, I think, fighting game reckoning in terms of trying to become more open to players. We could argue that Firaxis has kind of done a lot in that respect with trying to make games like Midnight Suns, XCOM 1 and 2. I'm sure their next Civilization game will be easier and easier to get into. And again, this is one of the things that we've seen over the last 20 years. There's been this general idea that we should make our games as approachable as possible. It's why it's a lot easier to go back to a game 20 years ago than probably try and play a game from 30 years ago. As anyone who's tried to play something like Might and Magic, the original Ultima, the original Elder Scrolls games could testify. But with that said, there's another point that I want to discuss. And this gets at one of the points I'm sure some of you will probably try and argue with me. And it's time to talk about how prestige matters when it comes to someone staying with the game. Because we've seen a lot of games from AAA studios that have been notoriously bad or very underperforming. Yet they still have hundreds of thousands of sales. They still have people who will go through them. And as an indie developer, you may think, well, if someone, hated Assassin's Creed, let me do my version of it. Or my version of a No Man's Sky, or whatever game, and it will sell better because it will be a better game, right? It doesn't work that way. And this takes us to this idea of how the studio's prestige and recognition also factors into churn. Most people who buy a Nintendo game, or Blizzard at their peak, or a Valve game, they're not going to stop playing it within 5 minutes, even if they're not enjoying it right at the start. There is this certain sense of, playing a game from a well-recognized studio. It's kind of like the Emperor's New Clothes in this effect, that we can't say anything bad about, or we can't just immediately quit because everyone's playing it, everyone's buying it. How many YouTubers and streamers right now, as we're talking, are playing the new Zelda game? How many of them play the new Resident Evil? How many of them will play when the next insert AAA game here will come out? How many of them are going to play an indie game? How many of them are going to play a game that could have very similar gameplay, even the exact gameplay, but comes from an unknown studio? Not that many. And as we've said before, recognition in this space, or clout, is a very important driver when it comes to the growth and success of a studio. If more and more people are playing your game, it means more word is getting out there. If more word gets out there, it means major names, streamers, influencers, and so on will cover your game. Again, no game succeeded because Markiplier or Northern Lion or pick any major gaming YouTuber played their game. They played those games because those games were already succeeding. They were building a fan base. Word of mouth was growing. Now, whether they played it or not would obviously have an effect on the overall sales. But these games were already doing something good enough that people were checking it out. And this is what you have to understand about churn in this respect. That a game from a major studio will oftentimes have this buffer of people who will still stick with it, even if they're not particularly enjoying or loving it as much as some of their other games. Elden Ring has a less or a smaller churn rate in the first 30 minutes to an hour than Hollow Knight did. Does that mean that Elden Ring is the perfectly approachable game? No. It just means that the name of Elden Ring, and of course, the name of From Software, carries far more of a prestige or far more of a rate to it than a smaller game, or to any of the other numerous Souls-likes that have been released. And it's oftentimes why, again, as a new developer, as an indie developer, you need to work 3 times, 10 times, 20 times as hard as an established studio in order to get people to play your game. And again, it's why when you hit that kind of bubble, you burst that bubble, and you're now a mainstream or well-known name, that a lot more doors become open to you. That someone is far more willing to give credit or give more play to a game from a Kid Fox, from developers of Dwarf Fortress, Supergiant Games, Don't Nod, and so on, than they would if a similar game was coming from someone else. And unfortunately, it's something that you have to understand as an indie developer. So before we get to the finale, one last point I want to cover, and that is how do you track or chart churn when it comes to your game? Now, the obvious way is to check out playtesting. Look at how people are responding to your game. If all your playtesters hate your game, something's not quite right. But the kind of quick and dirty, or maybe more like long-term quick and dirty solution, is to use the achievement rates of your games. Whether you can have like progression-based achievements, beat stage 1, beat stage 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or even something that's going to generally or most naturally occur through playing. Get 100 points of health, get a new weapon, upgrade your sword, upgrade your armor, things that we can track generally over the course of playing the game. And the problem, however, is that you can't do this immediately. Your game was released yesterday and you automatically start checking achievement rates the day after is not going to give you a good readout. Some people will buy a game, they'll play it, and then go, I'll come back to it over a weekend or in my spare time. I would say safely, 6 months to a year after a game is released is a good time to take a measured look at the achievement rates and churn rates of your game. If you want to do like a very quick assessment, I would say at least 1 month. But there's a reason why for this video I said that what we're talking about today, this is more about the long-term health of your studio and your game dev career, rather than being able to immediately fix issues. Now, of course, there are extreme circumstances, such as if a game is released and everyone hates it. Like, it is just mostly negative or all negative within week 1. At that point, you have to do some very emergency work. But if we're talking about games that are like mostly positive or positive, that kind of area, again, 6 months to a year is a good time frame to then start looking at. And especially you want to look at this if you're about to move on to a sequel or to another project and see what you can take away from this one. And one final point before the finale of this video. What we're discussing when it comes to examining the churn rate of your game is not directly, correlating to the number of people who bought it. If you have 100 people who buy your game or 100,000 people buying your game, you can still use the achievement rates or achievements to track the churn of your game. Of course, the more people who obviously buy and play your game, the better it's going to be for you. And like we've said, if you have your game, and let's say you do lose 5-10% of the player base within an hour, depending upon the kind of game that is, that's not horrible. What you're looking for are major churn spikes. So I'm talking about going from 100 to 74 to 43 to 18. If you're going like 100, 97, 94, 88, 87, 84, that's not the worst thing. That's actually really damn good. And again, if you can have your game, no matter how long it is, no matter how short it is, if you can get a clear rate of, I would say, 40% or more of your player base, then you have done a fantastic job. If it's like below 10% of the people who bought your game, then you may need to look into things and see what happened with my title. So to wrap things up for this video, churn is a very important aspect. It's not something a lot of people generally want to hear. Most people aren't going to search online about why do people hate my game and want to curse me out. But understanding not only the inherent churn rates of a specific genre, but what are the problems with your game, are great ways to improve and iterate on your design. As we've said, when it comes to even playtesting, you do not want to find out that people hate your game 5 days after launch. You should learn why people are hating your game during playtesting, while it's in alpha. And if you can improve, if you can iterate and evolve your design, ultimately it will make your games as a whole far better. Because the studios that continue to grow and continue to improve, they are trying to mitigate these issues before anyone even knows about them. And again, it's oftentimes why success breeds success in this space. If you're already doing great stuff with your game design, if you're already stopping onboarding and pain point issues before anyone even gets to them, more people are going to be willing to play your game. They're going to stick with it longer. So that even if, let's say, again, a lot of people quit your game, they never finish it. If you can go from a 10% clear rate to a 30, a 40% clear rate, that means that more and more of the audience is sticking with it. And again, you want someone, obviously you don't want someone to quit your game at all, but you want them to leave, if they do, on a happy note. Maybe they've seen everything they want. Maybe they don't want to spend the next 100 hours grinding, chopping down trees to build a fort, to then build an alchemy table, to then get gold, to then build a gold sword, and so on and so forth. But you don't want them to leave your game unhappy or frustrated, or they hate your experience. And if you do it like that, they're never going to come back. And as you improve as a designer, again, you already have your hardcore fans. You have that vocal minority. Your goal is you want more and more people to be checking out your game. There is not a single video game that helped a studio grow where 60, 70, 80% of the player base stopped playing within 30 minutes. I don't care how many copies of that game were sold. I don't care how many awards it earned. If you are down to 20% of the people still playing your game after 30 minutes, something has gone horribly wrong. And it does not matter, again, if your game is as complicated as Stellaris or as simple to play as Candy Crush. In fact, if you can't keep people playing your game, if you made like a Candy Crush or a Flappy Bird clone, something has again gone dreadfully wrong. So, with that said, thank you for watching today's Critical Thought. If you're new, do the liking, subscribing, YouTubing stuff. Let me know how much you hate games like Hollow Knight and Doom Eternal in the comments down below. Be sure to visit our Discord and Patreon, and come back for the other sessions on game design here, and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.